Today, and actually all this next week, people of justice and goodwill, people of faith and hope, and sisters all over the UCC and in many other churches as well, remember a day in 1969 when the justice movement began. The date was June 27th, 1969. The place was Greenwich Village in New York City. Police raid the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar. 7 detectives were there, interestingly in clothing that allowed them to be unnoticed in this drag bar, and 1 officer in uniform, meant, of course, to intimidate. And they let the crowd, all 8 of them, let the crowd know that they were there. Instantly, the fun stopped. Officers demanded identification, and those without were arrested and put into paddy wagons. But the scene was predictable and often repeated, so all who were there knew the drill. But what happened next was unscripted and unpredictable. We're told by historians that there's some question about exactly what happened. Either a really butch lesbian in men's clothing, or a drag queen complete with makeup and wig, stopped in the doorway to the Stonewall Inn, struck a defiant pose, can't you see it? And sparked the crowd's sense of justice. Many reached into their pockets and employed the only tools they could find to resist. They took coins out of their pockets and threw them at the officers. Now it's interesting, as we look back and analyze this event, to know that the coins were more than just handy. They were symbolic. They were symbolic of what the crowds had endured time after time. You see, in throwing the coins, they mocked the practice of the police, which was to come in, raid the bar, and then take the money out of the tills and put it in their pockets. So this time, the drag queens took the money out of their pockets and seemed to say, "This is what you came for. Now we're giving it to you." Well, on this action, the police escalated their violent attack as the cross-dressing crowd began shouting. Riot police showed up in full riot gear and made their way down Christopher Street. When the fully clad police turned around, they came face to face with a chorus line of drag queens, chanting that now famous taunt about their own power attire. "We are the Stonewall girls. We wear our hair in curls. We wear our dungarees above our Nelly knees." Now imagine, get in your mind the counterpoint of costuming in this drama. The full riot protection of helmets and bulletproof vests, and standing behind them, short skirts and feather boas. A detective who had served in combat in Vietnam was heard to say, "There was never a time in my life when I was more afraid." From this unlikely scene, and through the action of these most unlikely players, a freedom movement, a movement for liberation was born. Some, from their place of no power at all, who were meant to just take it. Some saw that what was happening to them simply wasn't right. So in attire that even flaunted more their place of powerlessness, they took the coins from their pockets, or purses perhaps, and defied those who taunted and traumatized them. And liberation began. David and Goliath, a somewhat similar story. The Philistines had decided that they said they needed, but they wanted the Israelites' land. And so they came in, as was the drill in their day, to take it by force. now. It was a battle practice, it seems, for each side to choose a representative to just kind of like come in the battleground and duke it out. I actually kind of like that. In fact, I think I'd be for it. It's a reasonable, less risky, more sane alternative to war, I think. But I'm sure that the Israelites hadn't counted on Goliath. Oops. Now they could not find anyone to fight for their land and for the freedom of their people. All bets were off, even for the finest Hebrew warriors. Enter David. Now, if we flipped back a couple of chapters in the book of 1 Samuel from which our reading about David and Goliath has come, if you begin reading at the beginning of that book, you will already recognize David. Readers have encountered him twice up to this point. The first mention was the text that we considered last week when Samuel, the prophet, the judge Samuel, names David the next king. He was still a young boy, and he was named the next king. The second message is when King Saul calls for David, calls him in from his shepherding work to play soothing music for him on his harp. So we know a few tidbits about David. You'll remember that David is the youngest of 8 on an errand when he encounters this military dilemma, the dilemma being that no one will go fight Goliath, and the dilemma being that slavery is impending, or death is impending for their people. Well, David, young and innocent and idealistic as he is, jumps right in. After all, he reasons, he's faced threatening opponents before, lions and bears who threatened his sheep. And he's convinced somehow, in his youth, that the God who gave him power to deal with these would be with him. Now, at its heart, this story of David and Goliath is a story of God's alliance with and provision for the weak over the strong. We see this in many stories throughout the Scriptures, but this is one that is graphic beyond words. The power of the weak over the strong. It's about the power that wells up when even people from a place of weakness face injustice. Even though we may think from our vantage point of David as a wise king, as a man after God's own heart, that version of David is years ahead of the youngster who faces the giant. He wasn't a warrior at all. He was the baby of the family who kept the sheep and wrote psalms and played them on his harp. And he was, as we know, the one who would love Jonathan in a way that stirred a scandal. This is the one who does the work of keeping his people from succumbing to slavery. This is the one who is God's person of the day against all odds. I wonder about God's choice. I wonder if God's choice was because David volunteers. Think about it. How often do we say that someone is God's choice? And the reason they're God's choice is because they were the willing one. And from that point, God is with them. David volunteers because he is absolutely, passionately offended by the threats against God's people. He is incensed to the point where he'll do anything, crazy or not. But Saul, because there was no one else, Saul was quick to take him up on his offer because he didn't have any other options. So the king brings David in and dresses him in the way you would dress anybody for battle. Saul outfitted David in his own armor, finishing up with his bronze helmet and sword. And as you heard in our reading, David tried to walk, but he couldn't even walk. It was a ridiculous scene. For an analogy with our Stonewall story, imagine drag queens in riot gear. A little ridiculous. So David took the armor off, and he proceeded to attend to Goliath, attired only in his shepherd's clothing and with the power and passion and sense of righteousness that the Spirit of God gave him. Any fear that he had was overcome by the heat of the moment and by the needs of his people. He was called by the cause of justice. His people were facing slavery or death, and no one would act. Like the customers at the Stonewall Inn, David became an immediate and unintentional activist, a leader despite unlikely circumstances. Because, now listen to this is so important for us to hear through the grid of our own life, because he was unwilling for his people to fall into captivity again. And so David summoned the ingenuity to pick up whatever was at hand, stones from the brook, and combine it with what he knew, his sling, to accomplish liberation for his people. David faces this opponent head on, states his intention clearly, clothes himself with the presence of God, and picks up the tools around him. Like the coins in the drag queen's pockets, those stones had meaning in Hebrew thought and theology. Think about it. Think about the role of rocks or stones in the Hebrew Bible. They were markers for places. They were weapons. They were an ironic source of water. Remember when Moses hit the rock and water sprang forth? They served as altars and as Jacob's pillow when he dreamt of the ladder to heaven. Stones, as we know, were tablets for the law at Sinai. They were coverings for tombs. And in the Psalms, interestingly, in David's Psalms, they were metaphors for the character of God. God, our rock and our fortress. I wonder if when David wrote that psalm, if he thought of the rocks in his pocket. David picked up something important and powerful, pointing to the very presence and power of God with him. Now, we know the end of the story. We know that the end was no more armies going to battle, no repeat enslavement, freedom at last, and the beginning of the career of an unlikely agent of God's power and purpose. And now, in our time, this human scenario unfortunately repeats itself again and again. We know what it's like, don't we? All of us who've lived very long, to have Goliath breathing down our necks. A situation or a threat that seems way too powerful to take on or to overcome or to simply endure. Indeed, we have Goliaths with us. We struggle often in vain to conquer the demons, even of our own character. Habits and addictions, fears and anxieties loom larger than life inside us. We may know, too, that we can put on armor when we don't need to. We can put on armor that covers who we really are and still not be protected from the taunts and tactics of those who would bully us. Emily Dickinson wrote, "I took my power in my hand and went against the world. 'Twas not so much as David had, but I was twice as bold. I aimed my pebble, but myself was all the one that fell. Was it Goliath was too large, or only I too small?" I know that some of us this morning are faced with challenges in our lives that beat us down, that threaten us every day. Goliaths within and without are the way of life in this world sometimes. Bullies and brutalities seem to chase us with swords and spears, and we feel with Emily Dickinson like it's us that is too small to overcome. But my friends, David's story reminds us that God's people have never been insulated from the brutality of life. We live in this world. And we know that God has led people into and through times of political threat, economic hardship, social ostracizing, family abuse, war, and divisive infighting, with the simple stone of promise. And this is it. This is what I invite you to put in your hand this morning. The promise of God. I will be with you. I will be with you. God's people are called to be in the midst of life, to go without layers of armor and live in the real world with the tools of the Spirit. Now, sometimes this means confronting directly like David did, going out and meeting the enemy head on. Sometimes it means coming around the back with surprise, like the Stonewall girls did. And other times, it may mean evading the attacks of the aggressors, like Jesus did time and again. There are many ways to meet Goliath, but however we meet the giants in our lives that intimidate us, we have the promise that God will be with us. For these personal struggles, I pray we can find hope in these stories, that we can be emboldened to take a chance on the God who is on our side, and to see that with our own strength, combined with the power of the Spirit, we can make it through. I would also like to think of this story and ask you to think of this story as a tale that reaches beyond our personal struggles and the overwhelming dilemmas and giant inner demons of our lives. It's also the story of a young, last-born musician poet, an unlikely, unequipped kid who recognized the task that was his, to rise to an overwhelming challenge with passion and stop the oppression from taking over God's people. Like the story of the Stonewall girls, this is an ironic story about an unlikely one doing what is right and just, even when everything says it's impossible. This is about using the stones in our own path, the coins in our own pocket, to do the work that is before us. Not becoming someone else, but taking on whatever the power dressing is that reflects our authentic selves, and doing the holy and righteous work of liberation. Indeed, we still have giants and brutes in riot gear in our midst. We have people and systems who want to limit and silence others and maybe even us. We could all list the people and the systems. I'm not going to name names this morning, but I could, and you could too, of people in our lives, people in this world, who would hold justice back. But I will name the issues, the places where modern Goliaths trample over human beings. Bullies in our schools and in our workplaces, and sometimes even in our churches. Inequitable health care. State policies that forget the proclamation of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses longing to be free. Racist attitudes that we're seeing in the political arena that masquerade as party politics. Economic systems that reward the rich and punish the poor. Just check the differences in gasoline prices and grocery prices in poor neighborhoods compared to rich ones. And yes, we still have the work of Stonewall to do. Like David, most of us have limited experience with giant slaying, especially in a voluntary capacity. More often than not, we turn away. After all, giants are too powerful, and we feel vulnerable and impotent, sure that our resources are insufficient. It's true that there are still giants and brutes around us, but it's also still true that we have the power of the Spirit, who points out injustices to us and then calls us to get off our duff and do something about it. Like David and the Stonewall girls, whatever expresses our created goodness is our battle attire, and the tools to make all the difference in this world are in our own pockets. Our voices, our pens, our votes, and our influence. We can speak up, we can act up, we can pay attention to what's going on in the world, we can pray and care enough to take a chance. Can't we? In 1969, the place was Greenwich Village in New York City. Police raid the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar. 7 detectives were there, interestingly in clothing that allowed them to be unnoticed in this drag bar, and 1 officer in uniform, meant, of course, to intimidate. And they let the crowd, all 8 of them, let the crowd know that they were there. Instantly, the fun stopped. Officers demanded identification, and those without were arrested and of justice. Many reached into their pockets and employed the only tools they could find to resist. They took coins out of their pockets and threw them at the officers. Now, it's interesting, as we look back and analyze this event, to know that the coins were more than just handy. They were symbolic. They were symbolic of what the crowds had endured time after time. You see, in throwing the coins, they mocked the practice of the police, which was to come in, raid the bar, and then take the money out of the tills and put it in their pockets. So this time, the drag queens took the money out of their pockets and seemed to say, "This is what you came for. Now we're giving it to you." Well, on this action, the police escalated their violent attack as the cross-dressing crowd began shouting. Riot police showed up in full riot gear and made their way down Christopher Street. When the fully clad today, and actually all this next week, people of justice and goodwill, people of faith and hope, and sisters all over the UCC and in many other churches as well, remember a day in 1969 when the justice movement began. The date was June 27th, put into paddy wagons, but the scene was predictable and often repeated, so all who were there knew the drill. But what happened next was unscripted and unpredictable. We're told by historians that there's some question about exactly what happened. Either a really butch lesbian in men's clothing or a drag queen complete with makeup and wig stopped in the doorway to the Stonewall Inn, struck a defiant pose, can't you see it? And sparked the crowd's sense